Last week, we talked about depth of field in a traditional sense. This week, we're going to move ahead in the digital world and see what digital techniques and abilities can do to help us with our depth of field. And we're going to start with increasing depth of field through a technique called focus stacking. Let's review a little bit. One of the rules of depth of field noted that the closer the focal distance, meaning the shorter the distance from the focal or image plane to that point of critical focus or your subject, or more commonly, simply the camera to subject distance, the closer that was, the shallower the depth of field would be. The underlying rule actually was that the greater the magnification, the shallower the depth of field would be, which also explains why longer focal length lenses have less depth of field. They magnify things, just like moving in on them. But that's really in conflict with another problem. The maximum quality shoot is going to be at the sweet spot of your lens, which is not going to give you maximum depth of field. Why is that? Well, because maximum depth of field is going to come stopped down, like at f22, f32, whatever your lens will go to. But at that aperture, the small iris is going to refract light coming through it, and it's going to soften the image. So you don't want to shoot there if you can avoid it. What you want to do is shoot at that point where you're getting the maximum sharpness at what's called the sweet spot. And that aperture sweet spot is usually 2 to 3 f-stops closed down from wide open, which means if you have an f4 lens, meaning that at f4 it's as wide as it's going to get. If you have an f4 lens, then your sweet spot is going to be between 5.6, which is 1 stop, f8, which is 2 stops, f11 is 3 stops, so your sweet spot is going to be between f8 and 11, not stopped all the way down. Well, that's a problem. It's a problem not only for macro photography, obviously, but it's a problem for product photography. It's a problem for landscape photography or urban photography, any place where you're going to be photographing very large or long objects, where the entire depth of that object can't be captured in a single shot taken at the lens sweet spot for sharpness. So a long landscape shot from foreground to background may be impossible to get all sharp if you're shooting at the lens sweet spot and you're forced to stop down. It may now come into depth of field, but it's probably going to soften the image somewhat. Well, that's an unacceptable trade-off. In the professional world, their solution is to use something called a view camera or a lens called a tilt-shift lens. But both of those are expensive, technically complex options. There is a solution based on the view camera for digital shooters. It involves taking a DSLR and mounting it onto the back, a real view camera. And here is one. Here is a Canon DSLR mounted on the back of a Toyo view camera. The view camera's bellows can extend for close focusing for macro work, and they're flexible so they allow for full optical movements. And this is going to let you control both distortion and depth of field and make a digital capture of it. It works really pretty well for both depth of field expansion and for those issues such as keystoning. This is where, for example, if you're looking up at a tall building, the building tends to look smaller at top. It gets smaller the farther it goes away from you. In the product world, keystoning creates some very weird shapes if you're looking down at things like plates or stemware. And the view camera solves that. So it's the go-to camera. But it requires technical skill to set it up and use it correctly, and it's not problem-free when you go that route. It is true that the view camera can alter the angle of the plane of focus, and it appears to increase depth of field, but optical movements don't really increase anything. They simply change the angle of the plane of focus. Therefore, they don't add anything for subjects where the front of the subject and the back of the subject are aligned with the lens. There's no way to set the camera to capture all of that. But the digital world has a solution, and it's called focus stacking. The way focus stacking works is you take multiple images with different parts of the subject in focus. You then blend those frames where the in-focus parts of each is all that's used to build a single image that simulates that increased or extreme depth of field. The downside to this is that the shooting requires an incredibly stable platform. When you're doing this, once the process starts, nothing can move because it will take each shot out of alignment and they will never match together. So you need a good sturdy tripod. You need to practice changing focus without moving the lens or the camera. But it's difficult, but it's not impossible. And a little practice will make it seem pretty easily. You could then take all of those files and blend them manually if you were a hardcore masochist, but software is going to make that editing process a whole lot easier. Helicon Focus, which has been around for a long time in the scientific community, and Photoshop, since about CS4, has been able to do a really top quality job of focus stacking, and that's going to make everything much easier. So here's an example that anyone can relate to in terms of size and scale, so you can see what we're really up against. Here's a pair of push pins. Now, if you look at this, you'll notice that only the tip of the front push pin is in focus, and yet this was shot at f11. It's shot with a 180 millimeter macro lens aimed at the tip, and only that tip is in focus at f11. But I want everything in focus, including the back pin, but I don't want to stop down to f32, which that lens is capable of. So here's the procedure for taking these shots, and then I'll show them to you. Compose your shot, and then lock the tripod as solidly as possible. You need to avoid moving it at all for the rest of this procedure. Now, start by focusing the first shot at the nearest point of the subject. Here it is in this shot, the leading tip of the pin in front. Then, note in the viewfinder where the depth of field ends in this first view. This will be your focus point for the next shot. So take the shot and then refocus to that point where you saw the depth of field fall off in that first shot. And take your next shot. Note where the depth of field in that shot ends. That's where you're going to focus for the next shot. And you proceed to refocus and take the next shot, refocus, take the next shot, until you've covered the entire subject from the front to the back. In this case, it took 9 shots to cover these push pins with this lens at f11. And here they are in order so you can see them, and you'll watch the focus move from the tip in this first shot, goes a little further. By now we're on the back of the pin, not quite into the handle. Then we're into the handle, but we're starting to lose focus on the front of the pin. When we finally get it to where the back pin is fully focused, the front pin up to the little guard on the pin is completely out of focus. We're only going to take the sharp parts of each of these shots. And when we do that, and then color correct it, because I had forgotten the white balance when I took those 9 shots, we get a shot that looks like this, where everything from the foreground, this front tip of the pin, all the way to the entire pin in back is sharp and in focus. That would be virtually impossible with a normal camera and a single shot to pull off. So that's really all there is to shooting for a focus stack. In the next presentation, we'll describe the steps that you'll have to go through to assemble that stack in Photoshop to make it work. But it's incredibly simple. This whole process is simple. The hard part is locking down the camera so that when you're shooting, you don't move anything. After that, it gets incredibly simple. So I'll see you in the next one.